The year was 1880. In the shadow of the gallows at the Old Melbourne Gaol, thousands gathered to witness the execution of one of the most infamous men in Australian history, Ned Kelly. For some, he was a cold-blooded killer who had robbed, murdered, and defied the law. For others, he was a folk hero, a symbol of resistance against corrupt authorities, a man who fought for the poor and stood against the wealthy elite. But who was Ned Kelly really? A criminal outlaw, or a victim of circumstance? A ruthless murderer, or the people's rebel? Before we can understand the moment of his hanging, we must step back and trace the story of how an ordinary boy, born into poverty, became one of the most polarizing figures in Australian history. This is not just the story of Ned Kelly. It's the story of a nation struggling with class, identity, and justice. Stay with me as we begin this 20-part series unraveling the rise, fall, and final moments of Ned Kelly. Ned Kelly was born in December 1854 in Victoria, Australia, the son of Irish immigrant parents. His father, John Red Kelly, had been transported from Ireland for stealing pigs, and his mother, Ellen, raised her children in poverty on the fringes of colonial society. Life was brutal for the Kelly family. The Irish were despised by many in Australia's English-dominated society. The Kellys faced discrimination, police harassment, and grinding poverty. By the time Ned was just a teenager, he had already tasted the weight of injustice. At 14 years old, he was arrested for the first time, accused of being an accomplice to a bushranger. Though there was little evidence, Ned found himself branded by the authorities as a criminal. The Kelly name became synonymous with trouble. But what choice did a young boy have in a world where the odds were stacked against him? Some say this was the moment that planted the seed of rebellion. In the rugged Australian bush, young Ned Kelly found himself drawn into the life of the bushranger, outlaws who lived on the fringes of society, surviving by robbing travelers, banks, and coaches. Ned idolized men like Harry Power, a notorious bushranger. Under Power's influence, Ned learned how to ride, shoot, and survive in the wild. The bush was more than a hiding place. It was a symbol of freedom, a weapon against colonial authority. But for Ned, this wasn't just about crime. It was about survival. The Kelly family's poverty and constant run-ins with corrupt police left Ned with little chance of living a normal life. By his late teens, Ned had already built a reputation as a tough, fearless fighter, a young man willing to stand his ground against anyone, including the police. The stage was set for conflict, and once blood was spilled, there would be no turning back. The Kelly family's strained relationship with the police boiled over in 1878. That year, a confrontation changed everything. Constable Fitzpatrick, a police officer known for his questionable conduct, visited the Kelly home. Accounts differ on what happened, but Fitzpatrick claimed Ned shot him in the wrist. Ned's family insisted the officer was drunk, aggressive, and injured himself. Regardless of the truth, the incident led to Ned and his brother Dan being declared outlaws. Their mother, Ellen Kelly, was arrested and sentenced to prison. For Ned, this was the ultimate betrayal. The law had torn his family apart. He swore vengeance. The Kelly brothers fled into the bush, and soon after, a manhunt began. When the police came hunting, the Kellys were ready. October 1878. The police tracked the Kelly gang to Stringabark Creek. 4 officers entered the bush to capture them. But instead of finding fugitives, they walked into an ambush. The Kelly gang, Ned, Dan, Steve Hart, and Joe Byrne, confronted the police. In the gunfire that followed, 3 policemen were killed. It was a turning point. Ned Kelly had crossed the line from outlaw to murderer. To the authorities, this was proof of his brutality. But to some settlers, particularly poor Irish farmers who resented the police, Ned was seen as striking back at an oppressive system. From that day forward, Ned Kelly was no longer just a wanted man. He was Australia's most infamous outlaw. After Stringabark Creek, the Kelly gang became legends overnight. They robbed banks in Euroa and Geraldry, but unlike common criminals, they carefully destroyed mortgage documents, freeing poor farmers from crushing debt. Was this crime or justice? At Geraldry, Ned dictated a 56-page manifesto, known as the Geraldry Letter. In it, he railed against corrupt police, wealthy landowners, and the injustice faced by working-class Irish Australians. He declared himself a man driven not by greed, but by resistance. The letter turned him from a hunted outlaw into a symbol of rebellion. For some, he was a Robin Hood figure. For others, he was simply justifying murder. But the walls were closing in. The police were determined to end his reign once and for all. As the police tightened their grip, Ned and his gang began preparing for a final showdown. In a blacksmith's shop, they crafted suits of homemade armor, iron plates hammered into chest pieces, helmets, and shoulder guards. The armor could stop bullets but weighed over 40 kilograms. It was crude but revolutionary. Ned wasn't just planning to fight, he was planning to make a statement. The armor symbolized defiance, a man turning himself into a living legend before the world's eyes. And soon, he would have the chance to wear it. June 1880. The Kelly gang made their last stand in the small town of Glenrowan. They captured the local inn and held hostages, planning to derail a police train and ambush the reinforcements. But the plan unraveled. A schoolteacher slipped away and warned the authorities. Soon, hundreds of police surrounded the inn. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the night. The Kelly gang was outnumbered and outgunned. Then, in the early morning hours, a ghostly figure emerged from the smoke, Ned Kelly in his iron armor. Bullets bounced off his chest as he strode forward like an invincible warrior. Witnesses swore it was like watching a man turned into a myth. But even legends can fall. As the sun rose, Ned Kelly lay bleeding on the ground, his legs riddled with bullets, the only part of him not covered by armor. His gangmates were dead or dying. Glenrowan was over. Ned was captured and taken to Melbourne. His trial became one of the most famous in Australian history. Crowds gathered. Newspapers debated. Was he a murderer beyond redemption, or a rebel fighting injustice? The trial was swift. Despite his powerful words in defense, Ned was found guilty of murder. The sentence, death by hanging. The date was set, November 11, 1880. In his final weeks, Ned Kelly became both a condemned man and a national obsession. Thousands signed petitions demanding his life be spared. Supporters argued he was not a villain but a victim of systemic oppression. Inside his cell at the Old Melbourne Gaol, Ned awaited his fate. He wrote letters, prayed, and reflected. Despite everything, he remained defiant. On the morning of November 11, 1880, the executioner prepared the gallows. Ned Kelly walked calmly to the noose. Witnesses later claimed his final words were, "Such is life." And with that, Australia's most infamous outlaw was gone. But his legend had only just begun. Ned Kelly's execution on November 11, 1880, sent shockwaves across Australia. Crowds gathered outside the Gaol, waiting for news. Some mourned, some cheered, and some felt the uneasiness of a nation realizing it had just witnessed history. For the authorities, his hanging was justice served. For others, it was the silencing of a man who dared to fight against oppression. The newspapers erupted. Some labeled him a monster. Others romanticized him as a fallen hero. Australia was divided. The Kelly story was no longer just about crime. It was about identity. After his death, Ned Kelly's body became the focus of great controversy. Initially buried in an unmarked grave within prison walls, his remains were later moved, sparking debates about how to honor or erase his memory. Thousands of ordinary people expressed grief. Farmers, laborious, and the poor especially mourned him as one of their own, a man who had stood against the wealthy squatters and corrupt police. Even in death, Ned Kelly had become a rallying point. Legends grow fastest in the silence after death. Stories spread of Ned Kelly's bravery, his famous armor, and his defiance on the gallows. Ballads and poems were written about him. Children grew up hearing tales of the ironclad outlaw who fought for justice. The line between fact and myth blurred. Some remembered him as a brutal killer. Others turned him into a Robin Hood figure, a bushranger who gave the poor hope. Ned Kelly was no longer just a man. He was a legend. The Geraldry letter, written in Ned's own words, became the heart of his legend. In it, he described his anger at corrupt officials and the way the Irish poor were treated. The letter revealed not just a criminal's mind, but the thoughts of a man who saw himself as fighting for justice. Decades later, historians would argue over its meaning. Was it the manifesto of a revolutionary, or simply the excuses of a criminal? Either way, Ned Kelly's voice had outlived him. To the families of the police officers slain at Stringabark Creek, there was no romance in Ned Kelly's story. They saw him not as a hero, but as a murderer who had left wives widowed and children fatherless. For law enforcement, his death was necessary. If Ned had lived, they feared, he would have inspired generations to rise against authority. This tension, between those who called him a hero and those who saw him as a villain, would never disappear. Much of Ned Kelly's story cannot be understood without the context of class and ethnicity. The Irish poor, transported to Australia as convicts or forced migrants, often clashed with the English ruling class. Discrimination was rampant, and justice was uneven. For the Irish, Ned's defiance was a symbol of resistance. For the English elite, it was a dangerous rebellion that had to be crushed. The Kelly story was not just about crime. It was about the deep cultural wounds of a young nation. By the early 20th century, Ned Kelly had become a central figure in Australian folklore. Books, plays, and eventually films turned him into a cultural icon. In fact, the world's first full-length feature film, made in 1906, was the story of the Kelly gang. Artists, musicians, and writers reimagined him endlessly. To some, he was a symbol of working-class pride. To others, he was proof of the dangers of romanticizing violence. Even today, the image of the Iron Helmet is instantly recognizable. Historians have wrestled with Ned Kelly's legacy for more than a century. Some argue he was a product of poverty and injustice, a man driven to crime by systemic oppression. Others insist he was no different from any other violent outlaw. Every generation reinterprets him differently. To some, he is a freedom fighter. To others, he is a cold-blooded killer. The debate over Ned Kelly's true nature reflects a larger struggle. How do we define justice, rebellion, and crime? Even in modern Australia, Ned Kelly's presence lingers. His armor is displayed in museums. His letters are studied in schools. His name still sparks fierce debates. In 2013, his remains were finally reburied near his family, more than a century after his death. But the question remains, should we honor him as a hero or condemn him as a criminal? Perhaps that's why his story endures, because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about history, authority, and morality. So who was Ned Kelly? A murderer who ambushed police officers at Stringerbark Creek? A rebel who struck back at injustice and gave voice to the poor? Or maybe both. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Ned Kelly was a man shaped by hardship, anger, and a burning desire for justice. He was both outlaw and icon, criminal and folk hero. And that is why his story still resonates. Because it asks us to look at the fine line between rebellion and crime, between heroism and violence. As we close this series, I leave the question with you, the viewer. Was Ned Kelly a folk hero who fought for the people, or a criminal who deserved the noose? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Crime Hub for more deep dives into history's most chilling and controversial stories.